Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our program this evening entitled Understanding America's Terrorist Crisis, What Should Be Done? Our program features world-renowned author and man of letters Gore Vidal, and is co-sponsored by Harper's magazine. For those of you who have not seen his new book, Gore Vidal is the author of Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, How We Got to Be So Hated. The Independent Institute regularly sponsors the Independent Policy Forum, a series of lectures, seminars, and debates held here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and featuring outstanding authors, scholars, and policy experts to address major social and economic issues. After 9/11, for example, we began a program to examine key issues involved in the terrorist war, and our program this evening continues this dialogue. As a result, we seek to get beyond left and right and feature speakers who present their own views so that we have a better opportunity to sift through and make up our own minds. For those of you new to the Independent Institute, you can find information in the printed program that hopefully everyone got. To provide some background, the Independent Institute is a nonprofit public policy research organization. The Institute sponsors comprehensive studies of major issues. The resulting studies are published as books and other publications and form the basis of numerous conference and media programs. You're all invited to visit our website at independent.org for further information on Institute membership and other programs, including our quarterly journal, which is called the Independent Review. This is the current issue, and the cover article is on the issue of the destruction of medical privacy in the United States. In addition, many of you may be interested in receiving our free weekly email newsletter called The Lighthouse, which critically examines current issues and reports on upcoming Institute events, publications, and other programs. In the next few weeks, we will also unveil our newest website, which is called onpower.org, where you'll find many studies and other resources pertaining to the issues that are going to be discussed this evening. Could the tragedy of September 11th be setting in motion a chain of events even more ominous than the attacks themselves? After retaliating against the al-Qaeda network and the Taliban, the Bush administration speaks of bringing justice to an axis of evil countries not involved in the 9/11 attacks. All while Osama bin Laden and company have escaped, Afghanistan has been bombed into near rubble, countless civilians have been killed, and millions of Afghans live in refugee camps. Meanwhile, the Middle East teeters on the brink of a major war, as innocent Israelis and Palestinians continue to be killed. World leaders view U.S. military intervention with increasing alarm, and international opinion indicates that the U.S. government is more hated than ever. Could U.S. policies be provoking this hatred and the threats to the safety of Americans and people around the world? And if so, how can we produce a safer world? On the domestic front, Congress has passed a feeding frenzy of corporate welfare, pork measures, and attacks on civil liberties as special interest groups stampede to profit from the current crisis. For example, the new U.S. Patriot Act authorizes police and intelligence agencies to spy on any American. The act was passed by Congress before it was even completely written, meaning, of course, that no one had read it when it was passed. Fearful of being labeled unpatriotic, the Senate passed the act with only one dissenting voice. Compounding the absence of political debate, government officials have intimidated those in the public who've tried to raise questions. Hence, there's been virtually no public debate. In effect, officialdom apparently believes that the public should not be allowed to discuss these measures, to know what's really going on, or to question government authority. As a result, Washington unilaterally declares that the new terrorist war must be a global war without end. with no clear objectives, no enemy to be found who is clearly existing, no specified geographical area, and no clear strategy. The enemy is not on some front, does not have invading armies, navies, and air forces, and since we are now all under government surveillance, apparently it could be any of us. James Madison, the master builder of the U.S. Constitution, noted in 1795, quote, "Of all the enemies of public liberty, war is, perhaps, the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the dominion of the few. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare," unquote. This evening, we seek to facilitate a discussion of why terrorism now threatens America and what should be done. So I'd like to welcome our participants, and you can find further information on each in your program. Please hold your applause until I complete the introductions. Gore Vidal is hailed as one of the most remarkable cultural and political critics of our time. Born at West Point, raised in the Washington, D.C. home of his grandfather, Oklahoma Senator Thomas Gore, he is a cousin of Al Gore and was brother-in-law to John F. Kennedy. He has penned 22 novels, 5 plays, many screenplays and television scripts, more than 200 essays, and a memoir. His American Chronicle series of novels covers the entire history of the United States, beginning with the book Burr and ending with Washington, D.C. His nonfiction essays have been collected in 8 volumes, and his latest book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, that I mentioned earlier, investigates the terrorist crisis. We are also pleased to have moderating our program this evening the San Francisco native, Louis Lapham. In 1975, Mr. Lapham became editor of Harper's Magazine, one of the most distinguished magazines in American history. The author of many books, he received the National Magazine Award for his column Notebook, is the host and author of the PBS series America's Century, and he was host and executive producer of the weekly PBS program Bookmark. Our panel of scholars this evening includes Barton Bernstein, who is on your left, who is professor of history at Stanford University. He received his PhD in history from Harvard University. He is a recipient of 2 Kuntz Prizes, the Goldstein Prize and the Johnson Prize. Professor Bernstein is a world-renowned expert on U.S. foreign policy, the arms race, U.S. silence policy, and weaponry. Next to him, Robert Higgs is senior fellow in political economy at the Independent Institute and editor of the Independent Review, which I mentioned earlier. He received his PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University, and he is taught at the University of Washington, Lafayette College, and Seattle University. Among his books, his widely acclaimed one called Crisis in Leviathan shows how war crises are used by interest groups to cartelize economies. The result is all manner of pork, corporate welfare, the trampling of civil liberties, and other repression. And rounding our panel, Thomas Moore is senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and is taught at Michigan State University, the Carnegie Institute of Technology, and UCLA. Dr. Moore served as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and the President's National Critical Materials Council, for which he served as chairman. Please join me in welcoming our participants. A couple of quick program format matters before we begin. After the discussion, we will have questions from the audience. In with the printed program, you should have received a question card. If you have a question, please simply jot it down on the card, and there'll be ushers circulating down the aisles in the main theater and also upstairs in the green room to pick them up. Please also keep your question to the subject matter of tonight's program. After the question period, we will adjourn, and Mr. Vidal will then be available in the outer lobby to autograph his book. And because of the numbers of people here tonight, we ask that there just be one autograph book per person. And also, it will not be possible for people to stop and chat because it will just prevent others from getting their autograph. So at this point, I am very pleased to pass the baton to Louis Lapham.
Thank you. Gore, I count it both an honor and a pleasure to talk to you on these subjects, and I gather from reading Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace that you would think that we are more threatened at this point not by the terrorists who may or may not be where we think they are, but by the mullahs in Washington. Is that a fair?
I think that they are a clear and present danger.
Right.
And we must be on guard against the Enron Pentagon junta that governs us so idly. You were talking earlier about who was the most surprised by 9/11. I had figured out some time ago, and one of the reasons that I have this little list in the book of unilateral strikes that we have made against second and third world countries, over 200 of them since 1949, 50. And sooner or later, somebody was going to get irritable. I mean, it's bound to happen. The first law of physics is there is no action without reaction. Our rulers seem to be blithely unaware of this. They can do anything they like, and people can go lump it. I was betting not so much on a Muslim strike as a Panamanian one. The fury of Panama when we seized their ruler, Noriega, which automatically ended all drugs in America. Have you noticed that since then? George Bush Sr. did that for us because he cares. And we got another one. I would also like to thank in passing Brother Thoreau, who has taken my James Madison quotation that I was going to begin with. People who belong to foundations stop at nothing. It has to do with that Rolodex. I don't know the sense of power it gives them. That was my Madison quote. And I don't share these too kindly. Anyway, in answer to your question, yes or no, as the case may be.
Yes or no. Yeah. But we have a war on terrorism, which is a war both on an unknown enemy and an abstract noun. Therefore, it's a war with no end, and it's a war that cannot be won. And it bears a resemblance to the war on drugs for the same reason. And the question then is, in whose interests are these wars?
Well, corporate America is the usual explanation, and I dare say that it is good for business. We were entering a bit of a depression at the time of 9/11, so if it was Osama's timing, it was very clever to hit us when we were really quite off balance. But these presidents, as they get worse and worse, proving that Darwin was wrong. I'm a born-again creationist with the last 10 presidents. As the presidents get sillier and more reckless, the wars get more surreal. We blow up Afghanistan when all of our enemies who struck at us in the airplanes that day were Saudi Arabians. They aren't Afghans. And the Afghans were rather hurt that we were blowing up all their cities when we should have been taking out Riyadh and the Saudi royal family, and perhaps the rest of the family of Osama. So we hit the wrong people. Now, part of it is interesting, that you've got a president that everyone knows he knows nothing. I mean, there is not an idiot anywhere in our spacious plains who doesn't know that nothing much is going on. And he's given things to read. When he has to mention a country, you know he hasn't heard of it. I mean, when he got through his little war dance before Congress with Iran and Iraq and North Korea, I mean, now wait a minute. Then you realize he doesn't know what an axis is. Obviously, he hadn't spent too much time on the farm down there in Texas. So you get, everything becomes sort of blurred. Now, the sinister side is the speed with which Clinton, after Oklahoma City, which I deal with in the little book, was ready with an anti-terrorist act. Speed of light, with the most venomous dialogue, condemning the terrorism of McVeigh and of the so-called patriot movement across the country. Then, of course, they decided immediately various of our freedoms were diminished, Fourth Amendment specifically. And I was startled how fast he was with it. Now we have the USA Patriot Act, which was passed, I think it was the 20th of October after the infamous September 11th. Congress passed it and, as is their wont, didn't read it. I don't know what feeling they have against it. Maybe they don't take it seriously. But that was a terrific piece of legislation, reminiscent of one of my favorite emperors, Tiberius. He was actually rather a good scout and certainly very bright. And Tiberius, when he became emperor, the Senate, in a cringing moment, sent him some legislation saying that they would accept in advance, sight unseen, any legislation that he wanted to send up to the Senate of Rome. And he sent back a message, and he said, you've lost your senses. Suppose the emperor has gone mad. Suppose the emperor is a raging enemy of Rome and you didn't know it. You can't do that in advance. And they sent it back to him again. Anything, glorious Caesar, that you send us, we will endorse. And he said, and I feel myself wanting to repeat Tiberius's words, how eager they are to be slaves.
Why is there so little opposition in Congress? I mean,
look who
hardly
paid
any.
For them.
Yes, well, okay. So we're back to the buying the best Congress money can buy. And the same, would you say the same was true of the news media? By and large, the news media makes no objection.
No, it's the same ownership. Those who own the Congresses and the presidents own the media. And it's all just, everybody's working together.
When you say that the succession of the last 10 presidents has gotten steadily worse, I think I agree with you, but I don't know as much American history as you do. So prior to what, other than the founders of the country, I mean, is there a real change, let's say, since the Second World War, since 1945, 1947, when we begin to build the national security state?
Well, that was the great change, and it was enacted by Congress, the National Security Act. It was 48 or 49. By 1950, Harry Truman gave us a militarized economy, and it was Charles E. Wilson, who was important honcho then, who said, why is it we're always taken surprised by Pearl Harbors and so on? Why don't we just stay armed all the time? So we don't have to rearm ever. We're just constantly armed. Every now and then a genius idea does bubble up from General Electric. And that was the genius idea. We have been at war really ever since 1950. And the list that I have kept my piece from being published in Vanity Fair, and even The Nation wouldn't take it. They couldn't face this list of places that we had struck at, like gallant little Panama, which is close to my heart, as you can see, and I worry about Panama. We have been like a rogue elephant going around the world, attacking this country and that country. And it was used to be because they were going to go communist. Many of them hadn't even thought of it. But we would always find a communist somewhere, and we would send in the troops. Finally, Ronald Reagan's greatest moment was the invasion of Grenada. And after, it was full of Cuban communists. Well, there didn't appear to be any of them there, but it was Alexander Haig. Remember him? I miss some of these guys. But Haig gave the game away when he said about Grenada as a military operation. He said the Provincetown Fire Department could have done that invasion rather better than we did. So we have this perpetual war for perpetual peace, and it does a lot of damage in the world. It certainly damages other people's view of us. But it has given an opportunity to those who do not like our Bill of Rights and those freedoms that we used to enjoy and are being curtailed. They can always talk about, FDR shot some Nazis that he found on a beach in the Gulf, and Truman and FDR locked up the Japanese and in concentration camps, and Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and so on. Well, these, however, were real wars. This is not a war. Because Junior says it's a war does not make it one. Because nobody has told him a war is between two countries. A country has an army, a navy, an air force, and a capital city, too. And they make stamps. I mean, how I'd like to advise him for a week,
But I also think, I don't think we've had a war since, I know we're in a perpetual state of war, and I know that that's the way the economy works, and that's why we spend so much money on the Pentagon. But since the Vietnam War, where we lost 57,000 killed, since then, unless I'm wrong, I don't think we've lost more than 1,000 casualties in all of the productions in Panama, Grenada, the Gulf, and so on in the last 25 years, because I think that the Pentagon is now in the movie business. They have the notion that American soldiers cannot go into what they call non-permissive environments, and therefore we stage colorful explosions in picturesque locations and present them as advertisements for the wonders of democracy.
Well, they had to give up conscription after Vietnam because everybody was going to Canada or into the ministry.
Or shooting their officers.
Yeah, and fragging the officers.
Yeah.
I served 3 years in the Second World War, and it wouldn't have occurred to any of us to go through the shenanigans that Bush and Cheney went through to stay out of the Vietnam War. One in the Texas Air Force and the other one in an undisclosed area somewhere, which proved not to be Vietnam. But I think we believe more strongly in the country and in our virtue than these people. These people are, for the most part, rip-off artists. Notice that they're all gas and oil men, from Cheney to the two Bushes, I think Rumsfeld also. And what this is really about is oil. And it's Central Asian oil, which is what we've got our eye on. We do have practical motives every now and then. It is not just for sheer glory that we get into a war like the Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the entranceway to Central Asia and 5 republics that used to belong to the Soviet Union that are now the largest suppliers of gas and natural gas and oil. He who gets his hands on that will really control the world for a while. Henry Adams, who was something of a geopolitician, and his brother Brooks Adams, had worked out that he who controls Shanxi province in China, northern China, would control the earth because it had the most metal, most iron ore, and coal, which they used in those days. And so our whole business in the Philippines, in which Teddy Roosevelt went along with the Adams brothers, was to get our foothold on the mainland of Asia. So we get the Philippines from the Spanish. We don't let them set up their own country, which they wanted to do. And we become a great Asiatic power, and we end up being emperor of Japan, which was good going, but we never got Shanxi province. Now we have a second big chance, which is forgetting about Persian oil, which is getting too dicey, and going to Caspian oil. And that is the background to it, and I've got a very nice story here from a surprising source, a quotation from a newspaper. I will appear to be currying favor, as the paper is your own chronicle. And I said this is when I was going to start with James Madison. As you can see, I've been ruined.
Before David stole it.
Before he stole it, throwing me totally off key. And I say, yet the simple reasons behind the various provocations that led to the attack of 9/11 was precisely stated 2 weeks after the attack by your own San Francisco Chronicle, where Frank Viviano wrote, quote, "The hidden stakes in the war against terrorism can be summed up in a single word, oil. The map of terrorist sanctuaries and targets in the Middle East and Central Asia is also, to an extraordinary degree, a map of the world's principal energy sources in the 21st century." End quote. That is what it is all about. So you see, you need never stray from the Bay Area if you want to know more than the editors of Time and the Washington Post. It also helps that a major player in the secret war for Caspian oil just happens to hang out in this area, Unocal.
Why, when the war is presented to us as a godly endeavor, I mean, that kind of geopolitical realpolitik is not what is presented to the American public. I mean, we're doing God's work, presumably. I mean, it goes back to Woodrow Wilson, who it's never clear whether he thinks that America is a religion or a state. And
religion, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, he invades Mexico to teach the Latin Americans to elect good men. Teddy Roosevelt takes Panama because it's a mission of collective civilization, and so forth and so on. What is that about, Gore? I mean, why? I mean, and we have the same thing with Bush. I mean, Bush, it's Holy Crusade. It's.
Well, that is an inheritance of our original Anglo-Saxon forebears. And the British Isles, I think probably over the centuries, have produced more interesting, even amusing hypocrisy than any other nation on earth. And we are the heirs of the tradition. We can't stop lying about motivations. And it's just as second nature to us to steal money and say it's for your own good.
Yeah.
You just spend it stupidly.
But do you think again, you get this, our friends in Washington would tell us that the imperial mission has the full faith and backing of the American public, and I don't think that's true.
Of course it doesn't. My God, every generation of Americans, including mine, had to be dragged into wars.
Yeah.
Second World War, 80% of the American people did not want to go back to Europe to fight, having been sold a lemon in 1917. Hence FDR's series of provocations, and this is not, I am a New Dealer, so this is not right-wing guff. Roosevelt provoked the Japanese into attacking us. The whole story is very clear now. It's all come to light. And he did it. Now, people say, oh, he's awful, he couldn't have done that. You must hate him to say that. I said, no, I admire him. If that was the only way to defeat Hitler, well, provoke them so that they will strike us at Pearl Harbor. He'd been reelected in 1940. No sons of yours will ever serve in foreign wars in any administration of mine. He's stuck with that. He would like to attack the Germans, he'd like to attack the Japanese, but he doesn't dare. So he provokes them into attacking us. This is Machiavelli on such a grand scale. I feel mean repeating something about a noble American president who ought to be on Mount Rushmore. And he ought to. But sometimes there are provocations that are necessary in a historic process. Hitler, we all agreed, was pretty bad. This doesn't often happen, that you have somebody who's that bad. So Roosevelt was on strong moral ground, although very weak constitutional grounds. But we've had less worthy wars since.
But I have read the reports in Washington, and they airily say that the American people would gladly accept 30,000 casualties during the invasion of Iraq. I don't believe that.
As long as it's somebody else being killed, they don't mind that as much as if they might be put at risk. But when we gave up the draft after Vietnam, and it's a mercenary army, basically. And one of the conditions is no member of Air Force, Army, Navy is to be hurt. And this is difficult to do, but one result is the planes fly at 35,000 feet, where you can't see anything. That's why, orphanages and schools are the targets of choice, whereas military supply centers might not be so easy to get at. No, it's a weird world. A mercenary army that is not to be hurt, blowing up innocent countries, relatively innocent, like Afghanistan. What we did, I'd like to remark about having turned over our military to show business. There was a stroke of genius, and I don't think anybody thought it out, but we lost the war very badly in Vietnam. Then it was redressed. They made Rambo with Sylvester Stallone. And we won it on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
And that's all anybody remembers, is Stallone winning the war in the jungle.
That's right. We now have the same thing. In Afghanistan, ABC News is denied entrance, is not invited to the battleground or even close to it. On the other hand, ABC, which is owned by Disney, and Jerry Bruckheimer, who is the producer of Gladiator and Black Hawk Down and Top Gun, and Bruckheimer, in conjunction with the Pentagon, will make a 14-part series, documentary series, on the war in Afghanistan. And that is what will be presented on ABC as news. So it's a fairy tale. I mean, it's the equivalent of the Fellowship of the Rings. We don't, and as I say, we've been able to do this for 20 years with very few of our own people getting killed. At the same time, producing enormous sums of money for the defense contractors and the various law enforcement agencies. I mean, in your book, you talk about McVeigh, and I think in a very interesting way. It's the most interesting commentary on McVeigh I've seen. And you make the point that McVeigh declared war on a government that he felt had declared war on its own people. And I gather you share some of that sentiment. I mean, I don't
I know
endorse
why he did
McVeigh's
it, yeah.
action, but I mean, I'm saying that, but do you think that the American government has declared war on the American people?
Well, the Branch Davidians at Waco had the impression that when they were being destroyed by Bradley tanks and
But it's also the constant, which you talk about here again, and the constant subversion of the civil liberties, the shredding of the Fourth Amendment, the seizing of private property. The Patriot Act allows the government to tap anybody's phone, open anybody's mail. You have, again in this book, you have a quotation from Justice Brandeis, which is a very powerful quotation, which I'm going to read and then ask you to remark upon. He says, "Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes the lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for laws. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. The lawless government invites anarchy, to declare that in the administration of the criminal law, the end justifies the means, to declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of a private criminal would bring terrible retribution." Do you see?
Indeed I do, and this is what made me interested in Timothy McVeigh. I read this, and he said he quoted this after he'd been condemned to death. He hadn't spoken during his trial, and they said, "Do you have anything to say?" And he said, "Yes, I'd like to quote Justice Brandeis's dissent in Olmsted." And he didn't do all of that much, but he did about half of it, and I was very intrigued, because I was quite aware of how the government, what they had done at Waco and also at Ruby Ridge. He had followed all that, and he decided that he would strike a blow at them. Well, I understood why he wanted to do it. I did not approve, obviously, of what he did. I mean, there are other ways of getting back at a government that you realize that you believe to be tyrannous and the enemy of the people at large. He wrote a marvelous piece, which he got published just before he died, was killed, and it was about the deliberate militarization of the police, starting with the FBI. He said, I'm a professional soldier. He got the Bronze Star for bravery in the Persian Gulf. He said, I am taught to kill, and that's my job, and that's a soldier's job. Policemen are not military men. They are civilians, and their task is to protect the life and property of other civilians from misadventure or whatever. He said, once you start giving them tanks and SWAT teams and so on, you are destroying the military, and you're creating a machine that may not be controllable. So they should have kept him alive a bit longer, because first he might have said who the people were who helped him. There's even, I hate to have to say this, but there's an Iraqi connection in Oklahoma City. Well, I don't believe it, but anyway, the FBI seems to think there may be one, but they wouldn't follow up. They did absolutely no investigation. They wanted one lone crazed killer like Lee Harvey Oswald. McVeigh could not have made that bomb. He didn't have the expertise, and he probably could not have driven that Ryder truck from Kansas to Oklahoma City without blowing himself up. It's a highly volatile mixture he had. Others were involved.
Go back to the point about the government being the teacher, for good or for ill. What kind of lesson do you think it is teaching us?
Government today?
Yeah.
You can do anything you want if you have force.
So that's the same lesson learned by the terrorists on September 11th.
Yes.
But again, I mean, we have the... So our government has also taught the lesson of terrorism, I would say, and I assume you would say the same.
This long list that I've got, I mean, the IRS seizing people's properties, ruining their businesses, attaching their bank accounts and not telling them. So you write a check and it bounces and you lose your business, your credit. Case after case after case of government running amok and nobody doing anything about it. Congress just sits there and deals in pork and raises money through bribes, that's all that corporate money is, to make sure that they don't pay taxes in these corporations. And few of them pay tax, and it's all legal because Congress has passed special legislation at the dark of the moon so that they'll be exempted. I remember one year ITT on several $1 billion of profits in the United States paid no tax, income tax, and it was all legal, been fixed.
So what kind of country have we become, or are we becoming? I mean, you are a man who writes lovingly about the American Republic, but that is no longer with us.
No, there's a sense of Asunción in the air in Washington. Paraguay is near. We are not what we were, but it goes without saying. That's probably the lament in every generation. But it is much more visible now. And to me, the moment that really tore it was November 2000, that when we allowed that election to be stolen by the Supreme Court. A serious country would have been marching in the streets, but we aren't serious anymore. We don't care. So, thanks to Almighty God and Rehnquist, Scalia and Thomas, Sandra Day O'Connor and Kennedy, we have been given this president whom we did not vote for. And I had great fun with the New York Times story trying to justify the recount in Florida. You remember the Treasurer's Report by Robert Benchley years ago? And he plays this treasurer of a company, and he's got all the charts.
Yeah, right.
You know, everything is falling off the chart, and then he realizes he's got it upside down. And so these profits are not actually profits. They were, Enron. I've added a later joke to that, but anyway.
No, that is what happened.
That is what happens. And how do you restore a country which I have often referred to as the United States of amnesia, in which there is no collective memory of anything before last Monday?
Yeah.
And watching television now, it's so silly. I mean, they come on, they shout, and they yell, and you can't remember anything you saw 5 minutes later.
You're
That's
not
merciful.
Oh, they have to get on to the next commercial.
Well, that's the name of the game.
But is there any, do you have any hope for restoration, as you say, or you think that's impossible? Certainly there's not
Where
much.
would it come from?
Yeah,
Let's say you had a great charismatic leader who really could sort of pull things together, kind of less shady Huey Long type. He was pretty good. I remember him with great joy. And Roosevelt was scared to death of him because he felt that he could defeat him. But then he was mysteriously killed, which often happens to our would-be saviors. If you had such a figure, he couldn't get on network television, so nobody would know about him. New York Times would not give him a good review. They wouldn't write about him.
Yeah.
So he would be just locked off with a vegetarian candidate, you know, and there goes Thomas Jefferson, our last attempt.
Well, yeah, there was an indication of that with the way the media treated the Nader campaign. Nader was regarded as a madman and a spoiler and so forth in the Times. You know, at the beginning when they thought he might conceivably be dangerous, they...
Watch what they did to Jesse Jackson, you know, in '88. He was a highly viable contender. and they smeared him.
So you're right. I don't think they would get on television.
No. And it's not as though we have great riches humanly on television
No.
at the moment. There is room.
So what do we do is the point.
Pray.
But to whom? I mean, not to
You pick yours, I pick mine.
I mean, then we get to the position of Ashcroft. We now have an attorney general in the our attorney general is on record as recently as last February in Nashville talking to 6,000 religious broadcasters and explaining to them that our freedoms do not come to us from human hands. Not a document, not a Declaration of Independence. Our freedom is given to us by God. And he also explains when he goes around to speak at universities that the United States has only one king, and that king is Jesus. And this is the Attorney General of the United States.
Well,
And he's also on record as saying that the only verdict that he is interested in is the verdict of eternity, not history.
that's very good, yeah, well.
But I mean, he is.
He's not
I mean, he's
getting
close.
either.
He is close in spirit to the disciples of Osama bin Laden, I would think.
Well, I'd think very like. I think they understand each other. I've got a wonderful quote from Time magazine, which is incredible, but it's very Ashcroftian. This was right after 9/11. A guy called, do you know Lance Morrow?
Yeah.
I see the name every now and then and avoid the work, but this time I couldn't put him down. It's something I never thought I'd see in an American paper. And if I can't find it, I won't see it again. Here we go. Now, this is a full-page think piece by Mr. Morrow. For once, let's have no fatuous rhetoric about healing. Healing is inappropriate now and dangerous. There will be time later for tears of sorrow. They always like to get the word time in anything in Time magazine. A day cannot live in infamy without the nourishment of rage. Let's have rage. What's needed is a unified, unifying Pearl Harbor sort of purple American fury. A ruthless indignation that doesn't leak away in a week or two. Let America explore the rich reciprocal possibilities of the fatwa. A policy of focused brutality does not come easily to a self-conscious, self-indulgent, contradictory, diverse, humane nation. America needs to relearn why human nature has equipped us all with a weapon called hatred.
That's extraordinary.
I mean, you know, Goebbels never pulled it off that well.
When was that? Oh, you told me, right?
That was right after,
Yeah.
a week or so after 9/11. Not helpful for our peculiar situation in history.
Well, perhaps I can turn to the panel, and they will
lead us.
They will show us a way out, right? Because we
Into
have
green
we have been reduced to prayer over here.
Yeah.
So maybe Bernstein can offer us a more secular notion.
Well, actually, Louis, I was hoping you were going to offer me the mandate of leading the group in prayer. But if it's secularism you want, as you notice, David shrewdly, one might even say guilefully, built upon a Madison quote, which was first found elsewhere. And my tasks were various. I could either devise something to say or borrow shrewdly. And I actually asked Gore Vidal whether he would share with me some of those pages that he didn't use. And the issue now is whether what you hear is the pages he loaned me, or whether I have to do it myself. You'll find the cadence varies, the humor is not as good, the pungency is lacking, and thus, unfortunately, this is autonomous and less derivative than I would prefer. I wanted to talk about two themes that are central to much of what has brought us together, that is terrorism and intervention. As humans, whether American or not, we certainly do and properly should deplore the killing of non-combatants who by definition are or virtually are innocent. But not only has President Bush, I guess we now refer to him as George II, or Bush the Younger, or the cheerleader who's president, I'm not quite sure of what the designation should be, but I guess we know whom I'm speaking about. He's told us that what happened on 9/11 was unique. It was the incarnation of an extreme evil virtually unmatched in human history and certainly in the 20th century, that these things should not happen to America. And yet, let's just scan briefly a little bit of history. If one of the defining criteria of terrorism is action against non-combatants, and I think we should properly revile the killing of about 3,000, mostly Americans, on 9/11. Let's think of not the towers in New York City, but let's try some other nouns that may resonate interestingly in history. Let me try, not at random, Dresden, Hamburg, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo. I pick those 5 nouns of cities because in each of them, at least 35,000 people were killed. In some of them, Tokyo and Hiroshima, the numbers may come closer to 100,000. Now, it's true they weren't Americans. And it's true it was a war. And furthermore, it's true that for the most part, those who died were non-combatants. And furthermore, it was known that non-combatants would be primarily killed. It was not accident, it was not bombing going astray. It was conception implemented with shrewdness, acuity, vengeance, and lethality. So what is so markedly distinctive about 9/11? Well, one, it happened to us, America. Secondly, it happened in New York City. Some Americans might have applauded that, but there's a kind of narrow patriotism in much of this. And furthermore, one of the distinctions often used, and I think wonderfully uncompelling, is that the terrorism recently was not state-directed, and of course the action against Dresden or Hamburg or Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or Tokyo was state-directed. And that is certainly a difference. Whether it's a compelling moral difference, I seriously doubt. But let me move to the issue of intervention. That is, speedily, George II told us that the appropriate answer was to destroy Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda network, all those who harbored him, all those who supported him, and others so associated. Of course, there's been some failure. He, referring not to George II, but to Osama bin Laden, presumably continues. Parts of the al-Qaeda network presumably do, although lower-level people have been gotten. But let me offer you a hypothetical. Let's assume for a moment that indeed the President and the United States have thus enacted a series of military actions which indeed had gotten bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network, nobody else, killed no non-combatants, had not torn up Afghanistan, had not destroyed other people. How many of us would think that this was a proper response? My suspicion is, and I myself am a bit ambivalent about this, that most of us would have a visceral reaction that a parsimonious, focused military act getting the malefactors and not others is a warranted and not an unwarranted act. Some of us would be troubled by the notion of an eye for an eye, kind of modern-day American Hammurabi code. Some of us might well be troubled by the fact that this seems to depart from notions of procedure and law, that there's something unsystematic and wanton and indeed arrogant about it. It is, but why primarily should so many of us be concerned about the acts the American government took? Well, first of all, of course, they were arrogant. Secondly, the contention was that 9/11 was unique, not simply in details on that day in New York City, et cetera, but really in substance, that things like this had not happened in history to anyone before. But furthermore, we know, of course, that much of the killing conducted by the American state in Afghanistan has been against non-combatants, not against combatants. Bombing is remarkably inefficient. It hits some people near where we aim if the intelligence is not unduly defective, and may even get some of the right people as well. It tears apart a nation, and now a president who said he would never go into the nation-building business has announced he's going in the nation-building business, will do it in some fashion for some time, in ways ill-defined, at costs not specified, to produce results unclear. But what this leads one to, if I may come back to the original theme with which I began and moved in rather desultory and spastic fashion, that indeed the United States is a terrorist state. It's not unique, but it is a terrorist state.
We now move on to Robert Higgs.
For most of us, national security policies and practices are remote from our immediate experience. What we know about them is what we see on television, what we read in the newspapers. As a result, I think we are apt to become the victims of illusions. And in the short while allotted to me, I would like to speak of three particular ways in which I think many of us are subject to illusions, and to contrast those illusions with what I take to be reality. Illusion number one: the U.S. Defense Department protects the American people in America. Reality number one: the Defense Department occupies itself overwhelmingly in preparing for or engaging in foreign wars against persons who do not, in fact, pose serious threats to the American people in America. During the Cold War, the Defense Department prepared for wars in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere against the Soviet Union and its surrogates. In so doing, the U.S. military establishment routinely protected regimes that at least pretended to oppose communism, no matter how tyrannical or murderous those regimes were. Since the end of the Cold War, the Defense Department has undertaken to defend certain persons, many of them none too savory, in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Kurdistan, and southern Iraq, in Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Kosovo, as well as the usual suspects, Western Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Very little of this activity has had a direct connection with actually protecting the American people in America, and much of it has had no genuine connection whatsoever. Illusion number 2. The Defense Department has the motivation and the capacity to effectively manage the vast resources placed at its disposal in a way that enhances the security of the American people in America. Reality number 2. The Defense Department is either unable or unwilling to deal seriously with its decades-long engagement in massive waste, fraud, and mismanagement, especially, but not exclusively, in its relations with the big defense contracting companies. The Defense Department will not even obey the laws with regard to its own accounting practices. According to a report by the department's own Inspector General, dated February 15 last year, quote, "We identified $1.1 trillion in department-level accounting entries to financial data used to prepare DoD component financial statements that were not supported by adequate audit trails or by sufficient evidence to determine their validity." That was $1.1 trillion that could not be validated. Continuing to quote, "In addition, we also identified $107 billion in department-level accounting entries to financial data used to prepare DoD component financial statements that were improper because the entries were illogical or did not follow accounting principles. Further, DoD did not fully comply with the laws and regulations that had a direct and material effect on its ability to determine financial statement amounts." And to think, Congress is wasting time holding hearings on the shortcomings of Arthur Andersen and Enron, which are veritable paragons of accounting probity by comparison with the Pentagon. Now, obviously, various parties benefit from this blatant lawlessness and public irresponsibility, but my time does not permit me to take up the question, cui bono? Illusion number 3. Since September 11, everything is different. Reality number 3. Very little of any significance has changed in the allocation of funds and the material conduct of the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus since September 11. The most notable change is that the Bush administration and Congress have seen fit to give vast additional amounts of taxpayer money, amounts projected to increase annual defense spending by some $120 billion in the next 5 years. Amounts that in large part are certain to be wasted in the usual fashion. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld himself said in testimony last year before Congress, and I quote, "We have an obligation to taxpayers to spend their money wisely. Today, we are not doing that," end quote. The destruction of the World Trade Center, not to speak of the damage to the Pentagon itself, will remain forever an indictment of the failure of U.S. defense and intelligence policy. The most curious upshot of this terrible failure is that the President and Congress have not seen fit to punish those responsible for the failure. No heads have rolled. Hell, nobody's even had his wrist slapped. Instead, the failed defense and intelligence establishment is now being rewarded with the greatest infusion of new taxpayer money it has seen in a generation.
I want to address what should be done, it's part of the title of this forum. Let me go back to last September when President George Bush declared, our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. As David pointed out in his introductory remarks, like the war on illegal drugs, the war on terrorism cannot be won. We will always have homegrown terrorists such as Timothy McVeigh or the Unabomber. There will always be a few people and a few people in the world who hate us. So we have to face that fact. We cannot win that war. Now, Bush has called for a new Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. He did this earlier this week, inserted, quote, "We will stay until the mission is done." What is the mission? How will we know when it's done? Will it be when we get bin Laden, dead or alive? We may never find his body. So Bush's pronouncement is a recipe for staying indefinitely in Afghanistan. Now, our desire for revenge after 9/11 is natural. We are the strongest power the world has ever seen, not only in absolute terms, but relative to the rest of the world. Our overwhelming success in the Gulf War, with only 148 U.S. deaths, our victory in Kosovo without any fatalities, our conquering of Afghanistan with only a handful of casualties, has given the impression that our military is invincible. Nevertheless, we should be careful and think carefully about where we are. To quote Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're getting corrupted absolutely. Our military, no matter how invincible, cannot eliminate the suicide bomber, the terrorist who will die for his cause. As long as people hate us, we will be vulnerable. The Israelis have been trying in vain to stamp out the Palestinian terrorist attacks. Ariel Sharon, who came to power promising security through stronger action, has seen a rise in violence since he took office and an increase in Jewish deaths. His military efforts have just produced more violence. And we, in Afghanistan, have killed 3,000 to 3,400 Afghan civilians, about as many as died in 9/11. Secretary Powell last week made the same point about Israel. He said to the Israelis, no matter how effective the Israeli defenses will be, there will still be people who will resort to violence and terror. The anger and the frustration will still be there. Now, why can't the administration understand that terrorism against the United States, like that against Israel, cannot be eliminated by military might? Well, we cannot eliminate While we cannot eliminate terrorism, we can reduce its frequency and violence. We should consider its roots. This does not mean that we are justifying the attacks on our people and our land, but that we recognize that terrorists have objectives. Osama bin Laden has told us why he's attacking us. It is because we have troops in the holy territory of Saudi Arabia. In fact, he was not notably against the United States prior to the Gulf War, and it was when we stationed troops in Saudi Arabia that he turned his hatred to us. And in his first tape after 9/11, he promised, quote, "I swear to God that America will not live in peace before all the army of infidels depart the land of the Prophet Muhammad." Not only does he feel this way, but so do many millions in the Islamic world. Since 9/11, we have deployed troops in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, also in the Philippines and Colombia. We are talking about stationing our troops in the Sudan and Yemen. In fact, we are pressuring the Yemens to take our troops. In each of these countries, the local populace resent our presence. In Muslim countries, the opposition is particularly hostile since they see Christianity on another crusade to invade Islam. Wherever we have bases, the local population resents those troops. In Okinawa, the natives strongly oppose the U.S. soldiers stationed on their island. Many of the South Korean population hate the American military in their midst. American troops abroad furnish both a motivation for terrorism and a target. If we brought our men and women home, would we be safer or less safe? I think the answer is clear. We would reduce the motivation to attack us. Americans would be seen more as we think we are, peaceful people who wish good things for the world. I realize this goes against the grain. It would seem as given in to Osama bin Laden. But if our objective is to reduce terrorism, it's the most practical and probably the only way to do it. Let us not let a misguided machismo stand in the way of protecting our people and reducing violence in the world. Bringing our troops home. By the way, why do we have soldiers in Germany and Okinawa? I thought the Cold War was over. Bringing our troops home would increase our security, not decrease it. Even before September 11th, more than 60,000 U.S. military were operating in over 100 countries around the world. No wonder people consider America an imperial power. If we also reduced our unseemly favoritism for Israel by taking a more neutral stance, our credibility in the world and especially in the Arab countries would increase immensely. This, too, would help reduce the hatred that many feel towards the U.S. George W. Bush explained to Congress why the terrorists hate America. He said, they hate what we see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. They hate he said, they hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. The president is wrong. According to a Zogby International poll released last week, a majority of people in 5 Arab countries and 3 non-Arab Muslim states view our freedom and our democracy with favor, but overwhelmingly they disapprove of our policies towards the Arab nations and the Palestinians. Kuwait, for example, who remember we rescued from Iraq, liked our freedom and democracy by 58 to 39%, but only 6% viewed our policies favorably, and a huge 88% disapproved of our policy in the Middle East. Other Muslim countries had almost identical views, and this poll was taken before Israel sent its military into the West Bank. Finally, attacking West Iraq or any other Middle Eastern country will only increase the number of terrorists that will seek to get revenge. Let us reduce terrorism, not increase it. The policies currently being followed and those being talked about will only produce more 9/11s. Security cannot come from violence. We should follow Thomas Jefferson's advice from his first inaugural: peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Thank you.
I'm taken by the 3 statements. Weren't you? Did you think that was good news?
Wonderful news. Keep spreading the good news.
We have some questions on the card, Gore, and one is, what is the difference between the United States war on terrorism and Israel's war on terrorism?
Well,
Did you just answer that question?
but I think it was well laid out, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
To be a little more even-handed in our dealings with the Muslim world. Terrorism is terrorism in any case. We should have turned over the whole thing when we were attacked, if it was indeed Osama who did it. The whole thing, this is perfect for the UN. Kofi Annan is well trusted. And this is for CIA, FBI, this is for police work, not military work. And it's, again, that mixing up of the military with the other. You know, a few years ago in Italy, the mafia in Palermo blew up the chief of police and his wife in a car as they were driving in great state through Palermo. Had it happened in Dallas, the United States would have bombed Dallas. The Italians did not bomb Palermo, even though all the mafia does is shopping there, and but you're bound to hit some of the family. Instead, they sent the police after them, and they got about half of the leadership of the mafia. And that's Italy, which is not known for being terribly attentive.
I have a question for Bob Higgs. Peace and free trade go hand in hand, but the special interests, or our special interests, we can't even lower tariffs on textile imports from our poor new ally, Pakistan. In other words, is there a way of reconciling our economic interests with our declared faith in liberty and what Tom was trying to say, an even-handed policy?
Well, indeed, I think the two interests go hand in hand. It's been observed by wiser men than I that when goods cannot freely cross borders, soldiers will. In the middle of the 19th century, it was well understood that free trade was one of the most effective policies to promote peace. And although it's certainly not the only policy that would tend to promote peace, it certainly would work in that direction.
Even though we have all the deck loaded in our favor. In other words, there are something like, I think, 36 or 37 wars going on in the world today, and most of them are about the control of a single commodity. Mm-hmm. So that in other words, I'm sorry, you know more about this than I do.
Well, the objective of free trade is simply to withdraw government discretion from telling people with whom they may make exchanges. And there's nothing in that withdrawal that promotes war whatsoever. Wars are the work of governments. And the government policy of free trade is simply a policy of hands-off, of saying to people, if you wish to buy and sell with people from Pakistan, go to it. If you wish to deal with the people of North Korea, go to it. And of course, nothing in that sort of commerce would bring about violence. Free trade is the kind of exchange from which everyone benefits. That's why they enter into it.
Gore, do you think we have, another question is to you, does the word liberal mean anything anymore?
Last time I looked, it didn't. However, this is the great triumphs of our civilization, and we have had a few. We're all liberal measures. I remember the first debate in Congress was 1935, and Roosevelt had introduced Social Security. And I fear my conservative grandfather was against it, but it finally passed. But the right wing said, if this passes, you will cease to have a name and only a number. You are going to lose your name if Social Security went through. Well, it went through. I have now lived long enough to see the conservatives were right. The Social Security number is now our tag, our prisoner's tag. It's used for taxes, it's used for plastic cards, it's used for everything to keep control over us. Little knowing that back then those fools were right, the honking geese. Not that I'm for revoking it.
Another question to you is, would things have been any different had your cousin, Al Gore, been elected president of the United States?
Consanguinity forbids my conduct.
There's also a question that touches on Bob Higgs about the illusions of the Defense Department. Are there any way of revealing those? Can those be made clearer? Have those illusions been in effect for how long? And how long are they likely to stay in effect?
They are illusions of very long standing, but they need not remain forever. And a number of people have made it their business to try to reveal the reality. One source you will find on the web at independent.org. Look under Defense and Foreign Policy on our website, and I believe you'll find many illusions shattered there.
Do any of you think that we have plans to the United States to proceed with a war against Iran, or a war in Central Asia, and act an even more active, aggressive, imperial foreign policy?
Yes.
Do you think that's possible?
Of course.
You share that
You
view?
don't build up a great army unless you intend to use it. This is poor Jefferson figured that out at the very beginning, as did Madison in the Federalist Papers, that you don't have a standing army because you'll use it, and it'll be very expensive. And what happens? And then poor Jefferson ends up inventing the Navy because we were busy fighting the Barbary pirates. So he gives us a Navy which he didn't really think we ought to have, but we fell into that one. We fall into a lot of things. But
Would there be any sense or means or way of our shrinking our military presence?
well, I think we're going to run out of money. It seems to me pretty clear the rich no longer pay anything. Junior saw to that. So they've been exempted from taxes. Corporate America used to tax on corporate profits, provided the revenues of the government was something like 45% of the total. We, the people, pay up another 45%, 46% in income tax. We're still paying 45 or 6%, and corporate America on its profits now provides us with 10% of the revenues of the state. Well, when you have a country so deeply crooked, how do you straighten it out? I don't know. But I think we will run out of money. I mean, there are plus signs. And finally, I think the world shows a certain fatigue with us, which I think is going to get worse.
This question is grassroots activism relevant?
Oh, yes, I think it probably is the only thing that might be useful at any given moment. We watched the far right take over school boards, and everybody laughed. You know, everybody's so busy creating presidents. But Mr. Viguerie and those money raisers down in Virginia, they just said, we're tired of losing, and we're going to go after the school boards. Nobody cares about those elections, and we'll grab them. So then they go to the county level, and they go to the state level. They've been very successful. And it also helps that religion is tax exempt, something that the First Amendment did not mean. If I were in charge of things, I would tax every religion.
I want to ask the panel if they think grassroots activism is relevant, or, I mean, Tom Moore began to talk about the kind of idealism that we ought to put into action, but I mean, what is to be done?
You're asking me?
I'm asking all four of you. I mean, you know.
Well, as I said, I think what we first should do is pull our troops out of the rest of the world and go back to let the Defense Department be a Defense Department defending us from our soil here, not from the rest of the world. And then, as Thomas Jefferson said, we should trade with the rest of the world. I would agree with Bob that the best thing we can do for the rest of the world is trade with them. I think it's obscene that we have barriers to buying textiles from poor countries in Africa. That's the one thing they have to sell us that could make them some money and get them out of poverty. And I think it's obscene that we have these restrictions on purchases from poor countries. We ought to be allowing these imports would help the rest of the world get out of their abject conditions. That's what we should be doing.
And what about at home? What about domestically? The government's still setting the, going back
I must say, Gore made a reference to the Roman Empire, and it occurred to me the other day that Attorney General Ashcroft was probably the worst appointment since Caligula appointed his horse to the Senate, so we are losing our freedoms right and left. I could go down chapter and verse, and the Patriot Act that eroded a lot of our freedoms, and even when the courts try to intervene, the Justice Department under Ashcroft won't stop. We've incarcerated, the State Department last month listed a number of countries on their, they have a human rights violations in a number of countries like China and North Korea, and they condemned them for having thrown people in jail for long periods of time without charging them, and had secret trials. Why didn't they list the United States in that list too? I mean, what we're doing here to our freedoms, I think, is just terrible.
Anybody?
We are as one.
Yeah. There are a lot of questions that have come in about wanting further remarks from all of you on the situation in Israel, to comment on your attitudes toward the Israeli occupation. What do you think about that? I mean, there have been many people that would like some. Go ahead.
Well, Sharon in Lebanon gave us a foretaste of what his administration would be like, and it has proven to be. He seems to be out of control, and whatever comes out of this, he has no exit in mind other than Armageddon. And that's serious. And at this point, if we had a government in the United States, we might do something quite active. Just draw a line in the sand, if nothing more, saying, oh, look, we've given you a lot of aid over the years, and we would like a little something back, like peace.
Tom?
Well, Ariel Sharon, when he ran for office, promised two things. One was to torpedo the Oslo procedures, and the other was to bring security to Israel. Well, he's battling 500%, which in baseball is pretty good. He got rid of the Oslo Peace Accord, and he is a disaster. What I think the Saudis proposed is the only sensible thing to do. You go back to the 1967 line with some adjustments, but what was supposedly a generous proposal at the Camp David was not very generous. It would have divided 85% of the settlers would have stayed on the West Bank, and they would have been divided into, the effect would have been divided the West Bank into 4 separate cantons, not contiguous. And the Israelis were going to control the borders, the skies, and the water supply. It's a little hard to call that an independent state they were talking about.
Gore, this is from a person that's read your book who says, what are some of the other ways of getting back at a tyrannical government that are not as extreme as McVeigh? What other means without blowing up a building in Oklahoma City?
An unpleasant letter to Janet Reno.
I mean, if we
give
if
her
we-
thought.
But if we have nobody in the Congress making the argument,
Well, we don't, because we don't have representative government. We gave that up some time ago. They represent, yes, but only corporate America. They don't represent the citizens. So in the absence of corporate government, you're going to have a lot of independent contractors like Timothy McVeigh, which is indeed the chaos and anarchy that Judge Brandeis was warning against when government, which is the great teacher itself, runs berserk and becomes criminal in its actions against the people. It is a criminal government, and its main target for its crimes are the people of the United States, who are well and truly ripped off in the interest of the Russians are coming, we've got to stop them. We've got to stop all drugs, all terrorism everywhere on earth. I mean, the dumbness, these dumb statements that come out. Are we going to also alleviate all pain? Why not? It's a great goal. I'd go along with that, except in the case of certain people, which we all have our lists of exemptions.
do any of our historians have a notion of how to get back at a tyrannical government without blowing up a building?
I think many people have already discovered how to act individually to withdraw their assistance from a government they regard as fundamentally illegitimate. And they do that simply by taking every opportunity they find and looking for new ones to withdraw their support, to not obey the laws they regard as unjust. And little by little, those individual acts of disallegiance add up. David Hume observed way back in the early 18th century that every government rests on public opinion. And so long as public opinion supports the legitimacy of a government, even when it acts tyrannically, that government will persist. But when people finally take it upon themselves to act, at least individually, by doing what they can to withdraw every ounce of help from an illegitimate government, then that government will eventually fall.
This question is addressed to me. It's about the imperial presidency. Who do you see in Congress safeguarding the republic? I don't see very many people in Congress.
Well, it shifted over to the executive.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
the wars have done that.
I don't see a figure of the stature of, say, somebody like Sam Ervin.
No. Or even Lyndon Johnson before he was emperor.
Yeah, or Johnson. But I don't think that's a function of my age. I think that's partly a function of television in a funny way. I think Clinton is a character made by and for television. I think that if Reagan was an actor playing a politician, Clinton was a politician playing an actor. And
Well, he was also the greatest waste that I've ever seen in the presidency. Clinton had everything. He understood the economy. He could explain it.
yeah,
And it was all there, and then there was this grubby boy who was deranging him.
but I remember the front page of the New York Times to give you a sense of where I think we're at, which on the day that the impeachment trial of Clinton began in the Senate, I was in the Senate gallery, and that story appeared on page 1 of the Times below the fold. And above the fold, there was a large photograph of Michael Jordan, who was retiring that day from the Chicago Bulls. And there were 200 reporters in the Senate gallery, and there were 6,000 reporters in the United Center in Chicago. And that kind of told me where our politics were at. impeachment of the President of the United States is not as big a story as the retirement of Michael Jordan.
So Caligula was right. In his appointments, anyway.
In show business, there's a saying that you always try to find a line to walk on. And it means to, and I don't think you get a better one than that.
Particularly if there's water.
With